Marc Bloc thus adopted a totally new approach to the study of French feudal society, which essentially attempted to analyze the society from as many vantage points as possible, from the standpoint of the peasants, the laborers, the lord, the church. You see how many dimensions he is creating through which he is approaching his subject. This approach led him to seek a reinterpretation of many of the agreed generalizations prevalent in the French history. He is questioning them also. He, for example, contested the view that French Revolution was quite radical in terms of what it achieved in agrarian scene. For the number of estates distributed to the peasants had been blown out of proportion. He found French Revolution to be continuous of the continuity of the Ancien regime of proportion. He found marking a break in agrarian relations. One might disagree with his conclusions, but what is important is the manner in which he sets out to assess the impact of the revolution on the rural poor, because the feudalism was not abolished in totality by the 1789 revolution. No. And he is saying that till 1793 constitution reforms, even if the peasants got some land, they became independent. That was on a very limited scale. That's why he has this this caution against giving full credit to French Revolution. Still, many feudal lords remained, and they are the people who resorted to work, what is known as feudal reaction. That was not in terms of, military or other aggressions, feudal reaction in terms of how to enhance or maximize the earning of a lord. That's why he is saying that he is, keeping his fingers crossed in assessing the impact of French Revolution, which otherwise the people have given credit to. One can very easily notice that Marxian influence running deep in Bloc approach, especially in his concern for the poor, in his seeking to relate techniques of production to the nature of society and so on. Yet, though Marx's influence is very prominent, Bloc does not use Marxist terminology. This is another way of, improvement in historiography, that you don't have to be, follow the jargons. You just simply follow the method. The second major element in Bloc's historical thought was Durkheimian. Like Durkheim, he is mainly concerned with social facts, and like Durkheim, again, he does not regard the sum total of individual facts as social fact. He also shares with Durkheim a deep concern for studying social relationships and their influence on various social groups, and also on their thoughts and beliefs, which in turn determines their actions. Marc Bloc argues that social classes are not formed by economic environment alone, a thought that was very crucial, but only when it is realized by the people. Likewise, social divisions become visible only after people begin to accept it as a social reality. Poston, for this reason, describes him as positivist in the best sense of the term. Social divisions could be treated as a historical fact only after it can be traced to the feelings of the people. They just can't be assumed as part of one's examination of economic environment. In Marxian terms, this feeling could be described as Marxian consciousness. Marc Bloc describes it as mentality or mentalite. His study of French feudal society is at broadly at three levels. First, the economic environment. Second, the social structure. And third, mentality. Mentalities, according to Marc Bloc, are influenced not just by economic conditions, which indeed he says that are important and even crucial, but also by the political developments, inherited religion and inherited social practices. Marc Bloc's main contribution is usually understood in formulating two notions of comparative history and total history. Block's comparative and total history, these are two very fundamental contributions of Marc Bloc, which you will find in my later lectures how they have been perceived and extended to. So, Bloch delivered a lecture on the meaning of his concept of comparative history. What is a comparative history? This essay gives us the impression that at the time when he wrote it, he was seeking its application in an essentially European framework, that is to say, a comparative study of different countries of Europe. He says this in this essay, I quote, "You can't write the history of France without the history of Europe, without comparing with other nations of Europe." Braudel would later considerably enlarge this concept by asserting that the history of Europe can't be written without taking into account the framework of the history of the world. He extends this further and brings Asia and other countries into his scheme. Ultimately, when I will be discussing Braudel, I will let you know that he has the ambition of writing world history, but his total world you will find is confined to the Mediterranean world, around that. But that is about Braudel. Here we are dealing with Marc Bloc's concept of comparative history. So, Marc Bloc's concept of comparative history did not begin with the assumption that historical methods follow a pattern which can be determined by a general study of history. Unlike Karl Marx, he does not make any deductions from an understanding of general historical processes. Marx has very broad categories. Though he does not reject Marx or refute even the applicability of deriving broad frameworks from the study of history. He prefers, however, or considers it a better technique in understanding history to test each set of facts by placing against the backdrop of larger comparative studies of other countries. One very important question that comparative history, according to Bloch, can help unravel is how identical customs, practices, even ideological framework develop from different polities and societies. Or how do social and cultural differences arise from identical economic or political state formations. In other words, why this uneven development despite of apparent even developments. Comparative history thus enables one to verify one's understanding of historical change. It gives indices of historical change to historians who, in turn, approach history with an open mind and with a large set of premise rather than any monolithic single narrow framework, which have already been deduced. How much of our perspective can change by going over to comparative history? Marc Bloc himself illustrates this in the perspective he provides to changes in French and English agrarian scene during the 15th, 16th centuries. He makes a comparative study. He argued that one severe limitation that both British and French historians has been to look at agrarian changes in the restricted context of their particular countries. He then goes on to question the assumption that agrarian conditions in both France and England were broadly the same, technology was nearly the same. So, if they were so, he asks, then why were the subsequent developments so different? In France, we find seigneurial reaction, which I just now told you, is known as feudal reaction, and England, it is not, the lords are not reacting in this manner. They are going for enclosure movement. Here I would also point out that From his studies, it becomes clear that there were two different kinds of systems which were, taking shape in two different countries. In England, the lords were converted or transformed into landlords, whereas in France, the lords remained the lords, meaning feudal lords. That's a sea change. That explains a lot of things. He then argues that had the English historians looked at French history, comparative study, more closely and vice versa, they would have found that feudalism in both countries did not develop along identical lines. In England, he says, from the 13th century onwards, the monarchy began to see itself as a separate power from feudal lord. There was a tendency to move towards, there is a rise of what we know as absolute monarchies. So, more concentration of power in the hands of the monarchs, which would be at the cost of, the lords. It began to establish the king's laws and authority as a parallel system of governance and dominance over the lord's domains, so that the serfs or villain not only came to be exploited under the lord's right, but also under the king's law. He was therefore placed under the double jeopardy. In France, on the contrary, the monarchy enlarged its position not by developing a parallel system of authority, but by enlarging the feudal domain and by appropriating more of feudal privilege of the lords to raise his income, and therefore came to accept or rather promote the entire fabric of feudal polity. This kind of alliance was there. The result of these variant developments was that whereas in England, as the king's law enlarged itself, the judicial and political authorities of lords began to get reduced further and further, increasingly, as they found their political rights curtailed. They began to emphasize their territorial rights, resulting ultimately in the bondsman becoming free and redefined as a money-paying tenant. Thus, the villain, the serfs, lost all claims on land, and the lords lost all claims on the person of the villain. So, no more, obligations or loyalty or custom would determine this relationship. It will be purely economic relationship. In France, on the other hand, because of the weak development of king's parallel law, the lords could keep in emphasizing their feudal prerogatives, so that even when there remained no actual serfdom, there remained theoretical serfdom. They did not become, the landlords. Implicitly came to recognize peasants as proprietors, but of course under feudal obligations. Thus, there could have been no enclosure movement in France. You don't hear about it, because the lords had not set forth any claim of their ownership. So, this perception of French and English agrarian conditions became apparent to Marc Bloc only after he took an in-depth comparative study of both the countries. Bloc's comparative history encouraged a large number of French historians to enlarge their areas of interest. Brodel, as I said just now, in part emphasizes it when he says that in writing a history of a particular region, one should not be guided by political boundaries of today. The other major concept increasingly being attributed to Marc Bloc was the concept of total history or comprehensive history. And they are given a broader framework on the basis of this, where you hear about a new economic history. New economic history in which these concepts were further elaborated. So, Bloc regarded history as being much larger than political or pure economic history. His wider concerns ranged from his treatment of sources to contents of his historical works. Until Bloc, the major documents used by historians were charters, parliamentary debates, diplomatic papers, etc., and were used for specific purposes. Bloc used these and other documents to illumine matters with which previous historians were not at all concerned. For example, he uses these sources to analyze the state of technology. His article, Watermill, just now I referred to, or the condition under which the peasants and landless laborers lived, their mentalities developed, etc. These subjects, largely dealing with matters of ordinary life, were indeed given a new and historical significance once Bloch devoted his attention to these themes. So, Marc Bloch's concept of total history thus implies two essential features. One is the multiple and larger use of sources and documents up to the ground level, up to the village level, and the second is the application of these sources to a wider concept of history, to a wider question, including within its domain all aspects of human life, from production technology to mentalities, so to say, a concept that seeks to build up a picture of a particular age through a synthesis of all elements of human life and treating these elements not as distinct or disjointed elements, but rather focusing on their interconnections. That is, he is emphasizing. History for Bloch does not consist and cannot be studied in one broad stream, whether political, legal, or economic, but has to be viewed in its interconnectedness, as influencing and being influenced all aspects of human life. This approach to history is best illustrated in his work of Feudal Society, where, according to Bloch, feudalism essentially consists of the following features. First, a subject peasantry, that is the Marxist influence. Second, widespread use of service tenements, German influence. Third, supremacy of a specialized class of warriors. Fourth, the fragmentation of authority and command. Fifth, ties of obedience and protection. Sixth, survival of other forms of association like family, state, clans, etc. Furthermore, Bloch does not see these features in isolation, but essentially as integrated, that is, one influencing the others and in turn getting influenced by the Poston, in the preface to the English translation of Feudal Society, from where I am giving this idea, rightly points out that not only does Bloch emphasize interconnections of seemingly diverse features in a particular society, he also is equally emphatic, equally concerned in the necessity of using general terms. This is an important observation because it implies a recognition by Bloch of the fact of social formations, a point neglected by his followers, but taken due note by Poston. This is of Bloch's one more point of departure from a large many historians who have been arguing since the time of Ranke that it was the business of historians to narrate in the language of the people of the times he was writing about, and they should refrain from defining or naming past institutions and societies, and thus their rejection of such terms as feudalism, serfdom, fiefs, etc. Marc Bloch, by ending the use of general terms, though admitting theoretical rigor and necessity of not using them, loosely emphasizes the fact that history, as it develops, replaces one social formation by another. Marc Bloch's concept of total history, though it is indeed very doubtful if Bloch ever himself used this term, was invoked by later historians, particularly Emmanuel Leroy Ladurie, to justify researches on marginal aspects of history, and then to suggest that these marginal studies constitute an essential aspect of total history. They form the core rather than the periphery of history. There is no justification for this in Bloch, for his emphasis is on the interconnections, essentially seeking to relate the periphery to the core and see it as a part of the whole, total whole. You see, the another gentleman whom we will discuss is Gordon Childe. You look at the time bracket in which all these people are there after Marx. Marc Bloc, 1888, 1944, this gentleman is 1892, 1957. I don't know why, how to explain this, but somehow these great geniuses were, you know, there in this time. Gordon Childe was born in Australia, but eventually got settled in Britain. Until Childe's time, archaeology had been a collection of antiquities, more in the sense of an antiquarian. Anthropology, a study of primitive tribes existing at the time, had as yet not been related to archaeology, except while studying skeletons in a rather non-scientific assumption that skeletons would help identify race and that races were anthropologically important. Child changed all this, and in turn revolutionized the understanding of both these areas of history. As a aside, I would like to bring in a recently published book on a very famous anthropologist of India, Iravati Karve, popularly known as Iru. In this book, you will find that, when she landed in Germany at that time, the popular feeling was, this is what I am referring to here when Gordon Childe is confronting this kind of question, presumptions. And it was said, she was asked to write a thesis in which the assumption was that according to the size of the skull, the brain, and its faculties and capacities are determined. And it is said that, the another premise was that Europeans have better brains because their skull is tilted somewhere on the back, or left or right, something like that. Now, these were the popular notions. Iravati is, going to do research in after the World War, and Gordon Childe is initiating his studies earlier. So, there was a very strong notion, like, will of Constantine kind of thing. And there was something was assumed that this is the reason for their superiority. So, these things, with the help of anthropology, Gordon Childe would like to question. And there lies his, major contribution. As I said earlier, that anthropology, that is the study of primitive tribes as they exist at the time when they are doing research or studying, had as yet not been related to archaeology, except that while studying skeletons in a rather non-scientific assumption that skeletons would help identify race and that races were anthropologically important, Gordon Childe changed all this, and in turn he revolutionized the understanding of both these areas of study. I mean archaeology as well as anthropology. He is making the first, very balanced combination of the two. His first work, The Dawn of European Civilization, published as early as 1924, is a watershed in the field of archaeology. In this work, he for the first time sought to define culture within quote. As understood today by archaeologists, we say Harappa culture, Nivasa culture and all these things, and culture when it becomes civilization, we have already discussed. So, culture, when they use the term culture by the archaeologists, it is, it is considered as an assemblage of tools and motifs, and hence laid down its basic definition. After establishing cultures, he then sought to work out the sequence of cultures by comparing the artifacts. He also sought to use latest researches in anthropology and primitive religions in order to supplement the evidence of artifacts with the inferences drawn from archaeology to reconstruct a larger picture of society when that culture prevailed, supposedly. For example, he deduces from the larger picture, he deduces from the study of primitive religions the importance of mother goddess in primitive religions. because Mother Goddess is assigned the role of, fertility, symbol of fertility. So when did this role was assigned to Mother Goddess? He looked into that question and gave it a meaning.